Let me introduce His Excellency Khalid bin Abdulaziz Al-Falih is the Kingdom's Minister of Investment. Mehmet Şimşek is Turkey's Minister of Finance and Treasury. Welcome, gentlemen. Douglas Alexander is Minister of State at the Department for Business and Trade in the UK. Ray Dalio is founder, CEO, mentor and member of the board of Bridgewater Associates and founder of the Dalio Family Office. And Makhdar Diop is the managing director of International Finance Corporation. And let me remind you that we also have two extra stars of the board of Policymakers this morning to provoke and poke. That is Sophie and Sean, our avatars, and we will be calling on them as we move through the next 45 minutes. I know that we're running a little bit late, but if you take your seats and bear with us, we've got 40 minutes to go now, and then we'll get you some lunch and water you appropriately in the event spaces outside. Right. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Becky.
Minister Al-Falih, let's deal with the challenges first. There's been much discussion about the uncertain landscape, and it's an unsettling global picture at present. And the global growth dynamic is shifting, which is something we've discussed across these panels this morning and is important for us to consider. The IMF's lowered its global growth forecast for 2025, citing accelerating risks from wars and trade protectionism. The World Bank also lowering its growth forecast for this decade, suggesting that it will be lower than the first two of the century. Given where we are at, and look, this looked a whole lot worse 2 years ago, by the way, when we had rampant inflation and Russia had just invaded Ukraine. But how concerned are you about the geopolitical and economic realities today, and how are they playing into the investment decisions that you are taking today for tomorrow?
Well, thank you very much, Becky, for the question and for moderating. And let me welcome everybody back to the Kingdom. Every week there is an event of global significance here, and certainly the FII stands out as the flagship of our global events. As you correctly said, the geopolitical situation is concerning. The barometer is at an all-time, not an all-time, but certainly in my recent memory. And the human aspect of it are truly tragic. When you look at the region, you look at Europe, what is happening cannot, should not, and will not be underestimated, and the Kingdom is doing all it can to bring peace and prosperity. But I'd like to turn the question over on its head and the thesis that you're talking about, and go back to what you said. 3 years ago, it was all doom and gloom. Inflation was generational in terms of where it was. Interest rates were rising rapidly. Unemployment was rising in some areas, and everybody was not only expecting a recession, but stagflation was being discussed.
Sure.
On the back, of course, on the post-pandemic recovery that wasn't taking place as rapidly in terms of health and human well-being in some areas. And if you had described the economic situation we're in today, people will think you're from a different planet. Because fast forward 2 to 3 years, and here we are. Inflation has been arrested, perhaps crushed. It's back to target levels, 2.6 in developed countries. Interest rates have declined in many countries, and the Fed has started its cycle of reducing interest rates and quantitative easing. There has been no massive recessions in most, and in fact in all G20 economy. And if you go away from the economic measures, you look at investor confidence, it is 15% higher than where it was. It is very high as measured by Ipsos. Tourism is back to where it was before the pandemic. And then you get this amazing technological shifts that are taking place. And you get the green energy and the many innovation, but on AI by itself, it is fueling not only capital markets, but it's fueling optimism. It is creating an opportunity for rebalancing global competitiveness amongst companies, amongst countries, and even amongst families and people who see hope that these technological shifts, if they are backed up by the right ecosystems and infrastructure, will create a greater future. And that's where the confidence comes in. But I think most importantly, it's reflected in the markets. The markets are usually, more often than not, almost consistently, will tell you where we're going. And if you look at the S&P 500, think of this. The last 12 months, it's 40% up. You may say this is US markets fueled by the Magnificent Seven and all the tech hype. Some people have said.
Degree.
But look at the MSCI World Index. Last 12 months, it's up 35%. And the investors, and many of them are here, and we heard the leaders in the various sessions today are not dumb. They would pull out. So there is a lot of, and then there is a lot of dry powder. I think corporates have deleveraged a lot, so they are willing and able and ready to invest. That's what I see day in and day out as a Minister of Investment. PE and VC funds alone have just under $3 trillion of investment ready to deploy. I'd like to, if I may, Becky, just for 1 minute, mention how is that reflected in Saudi Arabia, because that, this is the area where I am closest to, obviously, as a member of this government. Our economy is in the middle of the Middle East, of course. We are the center of the Middle East, and we feel the pain that is happening at the human level. And we see the disruptions in the Red Sea. And some of the audience may ask, how is that reflected on the economic environment and the business environment? And obviously, headwinds will reflect any economy. But thanks to His Royal Highness, thanks to the vision, the tailwinds are much stronger than the headwinds. And the economy of Saudi Arabia under Vision 2030 is navigating these geopolitical and macroeconomic and global challenges, including trade tensions and political conflicts, extremely well. If I just give you some indicators, our GDP has grown by 70% since the vision was launched. If you look at the G20 countries during this period, and despite fluctuations and shocks of different kinds, including oil markets shock, the Saudi economy has been the second fastest growing economy amongst the G20. And I think what is more reassuring for us, proof point that Vision 2030 is working, is that the non-oil economy has been growing at 4 to 5% since 2017, consistently, including this year and last year. If I shift to investment, we have targeted $3.3 trillion of direct investment, what we call gross capital formation. And I'm happy to say that gross capital formation is growing at above 10% year on year. This is total investment. FDI is also ahead of target under the National Investment Strategy. Last year, we recorded $26 billion of FDI. The last 3 years, average, if we average to adjust and normalize for fluctuation, it's 2.5x the 3 years before and about 4x of what it was before Vision 2030. Venture capital is going into innovation. New sectors, our tourism from almost nothing. We recorded last year 100 million tourists visit, and the list goes on that proves that amongst the headline news that you broadcast in CNN every day, the rest of us who are running economies are focused on building prosperity, creating a future, creating jobs, and our companies are profitable and making money. Foreign investors in Saudi Arabia are voting both with their feet and with their money, as I mentioned with FDI, but the number of licensed international companies is 10x of what it used to be before the vision.
I know you're teasing me, and you know that we applaud the success as well as report on the challenges, sir. To sustain this ambition in what is, a different growth dynamic than we've had over the past couple of decades, I think it's important to talk about policy priorities. And I think the competitive edge, as you will, I'm sure, point out here, is the agility that you have, the opportunity that you have in a country like Saudi to really look at the landscape and say, how do we make ourselves more resilient? How do we sustain our numbers and grow this economy with a policy sort of framework that can, to a certain extent, move quicker than in many other parts of the world? And I'm interested to get your reflections on that as we move through this session, but thank you for the time being. I want to bring in the others. This is a bit of a rapid fire, if you will, so just through your own lenses, before we drill down on your own individual files, as it were. You've listened to His Excellency. We've heard, to a certain extent, the wider story and then the prism through the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. To each of you, how concerned are you about the geopolitical and economic realities today? Very briefly, sir.
Well, we are concerned about the risk of escalation of the ongoing conflicts, even though I think the risk is small, but it's not completely ignorable. Mm-hmm. Typically, that would be the worst case scenario because Turkey is a highly diversified economy. We tend to benefit from a more stable and prosperous region, so conflicts don't help. Mm. And they tend to have negative impact through energy channel, through trade channel. So clearly that would be one risk. The second risk is, of course, US elections matter in terms of whether we get a more fragmented global backdrop or not. Mm-hmm. It looks like, maybe it's a base case scenario that more trade fragmentation could be in the pipeline. The good news is we have free trade agreements with about 54 countries around the world, and that covers about 60% of our trade. Mm-hmm. So fragmentation is a real risk, but we also tend to benefit from nearshoring and friendshoring. So even though that's a risk, I think we are more resilient to that risk.
Thank you, and I'll come back to the Turkey story very specifically momentarily. Douglas Alexander.
Well, in Europe at the start of the 20th century, war was followed by pandemic. At the start of the 21st, pandemic has been followed by war. So it's a challenging geopolitical environment. Really for the last 40 years, for the first 40 years of globalization, most CEOs and capital allocators didn't have to give much consideration to geopolitics and could instead focus on ensuring flows of capital, services, goods, and people at ever higher velocity around the world. And I think what we've seen in recent years is politics making a comeback. Politics domestically and geopolitics internationally. Whether that's a coincidence of economic anger, cultural anxiety, and political alienation at home, or whether it's the significant challenges to the international order that we've seen. So as I look ahead, as you've said, both the IMF and the World Bank have been pretty anemic in their predictions in terms of global growth. Many analysts are asking about surely the most consequential global relationship between the US and China as we look ahead to the next week's presidential election. The analysts ask if the hard decoupling from Russia is going to be followed by a soft decoupling from China. I think it's important to recognize just how interdependent those two global economic powers remain. And in that sense, as in the challenge of interdependence, we are fated to live together, and we have to find effective ways of ensuring the global trading system maintains its dynamism. It was back in 1963 that John F. Kennedy said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." I think we've learned that that is, if you like, an ambition rather than an achievement, but it's an ambition that I sense policymakers around the world are determined to try and realize.
Thank you. Ray, you have identified 5 trends shaping global affairs: debt money and the economic cycle, internal order and disorder, great power conflicts, namely the relationship between the US and China, acts of nature and technology. You sit sort of, those key trends sit very sort of squarely in this conversation that we are having here. So how concerned are you?
The world order is changing in profound ways. And in order to understand rises and declines of reserve currencies and countries, I studied the last 500 years, and I'm a practical decision maker, so I do it for betting on what's going to happen now. And in that context, there are these 5 big forces, which are, there's the debt money, reserve currency question of the dominant empire. That's a big issue. We have a lot of debt, and that debt will be a problem as we're evolving. The second influence is the internal peace and conflict, and we're seeing threat to democracies, some of these democracies, in which there's a disorder, but it varies from country to country. I should say that the important thing is to understand the distinctions. So for example, this is one of the things that makes different regions attractive. So second force is internal order and disorder. Do you work together, or do you have irreconcilable differences? I think that's a force. Third force is, of course, the changing world order, the great power conflicts and so on, in an environment where leadership or dominance of the dominant power and the dominant reserve currency will not be the same. Fourth influence throughout time, these are all the big influences through history, is acts of nature, droughts, floods, and pandemics. And so that force is, of course, a dominant force, particularly important force. These forces interact, and then the fifth force is technology. And we know that we're going to have a technology revolution. So we're going to go through a time warp. The thing that I want to emphasize is that that's very different from which location you are in. One of the great things, the reason I'm weaving my life and my family's involvement in terms of family office and so on into the GCC is that it is one of those places, particularly Saudi and the UAE, are places in which you have the basic fundamentals. I would say the most important thing when looking at different locations is, first, the financial. Do you earn more money than you spend? So do you have a good income statement and balance sheet? Second, do you have internal order in which, rather than conflict, you have good leadership and management? I think His Royal Highness is a great leader who has, he's almost like a Deng Xiaoping of China, in a sense, or a Lee Kuan Yew. And then number 3 is this world order problem. And that is a challenge for everybody, but I think they have the ability to do that. Number 4, climate, of course, and then technology, which I think is dominant. So I think you have to look at the differences, the conflicts, the differences in places. And then to invest, you have to diversify well within that context.
And you are reminding us that none of this is new, actually. These are forces that have been, around for a very long time. Were we to read our history books as well as you do, perhaps we would be less unsettled by what are unprecedented times. Magda, let me bring you in because Ray identifies debt as one of the key drivers, key trends that he sees now and in legacy terms. The debt picture for emerging markets and developing economies is a real downside risk to progress. The debt picture for developed countries around the world is also pretty worrying at present. How concerned are you? And then we're sticking with the concern and the caution at this point because I want to flip this on its head and talk about how we create some optimism and how policy making might provide some hope with a healthy dose of realism going forward. I just want to stop though because this is very much your file when it comes to the work that you do. How concerned are you about the current crisis?
No, thank you, Becky. I want to come back to what have been said about the uncertainty. Debt issues have to be solved with growth in countries, and growth is often related in emerging countries with trade. So trade fragmentation has an impact on growth and on debt issues that countries are facing. So for me, the number one risk currently is trade issues. That fragmentation that you have is excluding a lot of emerging countries or low-income countries from the supply chain. This is a huge risk. Secondly, I think that on technology, the decoupling that we're having on technology and the divide, the growing divide that we have with AI, will create a two-speed growth in the world and a risk of increasing that dependencies of low-income countries, low-income countries to more advanced economies. I'm very concerned also about the concentration that you have on technology and on market linked to AI. Because as we go, we will see that less and less countries have the data that will allow them to be able to run models on AI and all the elements around the system. Third, all this is reflecting on something that we don't talk about, is migration. If you talk about the politics of each of these countries, migration is becoming a central theme in the conversation. So it doesn't allow a good movement of people, but also will raise some tensions that we will need to deal with as we go. And if we don't solve the issue of debt, of growth, this tension will be exacerbated and will be increasing the uncertainties that has been highlighted earlier. So I do think that as we discuss these issues, we need to talk about the distributional impact of growth policies, which for me would be a central theme of the new rebound that people need to have if they want to have the sustainability. And it's not an issue only of emerging economies. It's an issue of emerging economies, of developed countries, and this is issues that are shared by all countries. So addressing the issue of debt in emerging countries will require also addressing some of the social issues that we have seeing emerging now and consolidating.
And we're going to come back to some of the policy priorities, and perhaps you've got some advice for some of our ministers here about where you would like to see certain priorities. Let me go back down this board, as it were. Ray, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to start, though, with you, Douglas Alexander. You're in your first 100 days in office under the UK's new Labour government. Tomorrow you'll announce the first budget. The IMF sees the UK economy as quite positive at present. I mean, both the US and the UK, they're identified in their latest report as actually quite positive growth stories. The UK economy set to accelerate and is backing the acceleration of public investment as being positive for growth. Now, that is important, particularly when you consider the Brexit critics who are and continue to suggest that Britain is stuck in the slow lane for years to come. For the benefit of this audience who may not be as imbued in the sort of, what's forthcoming in the budget, Rachel Reeves spoke at the IMF the other day, so I think there's some stuff that you can actually talk to here. Debt rules and change to fiscal policy, a clear change to fiscal policy. Can you just briefly explain how you believe policy, fiscal policy and a change to debt rules might, or I'm sure you hope, accelerate the growth picture for the UK?
Of course. I'll say a word on the politics and then I'll answer your question on the economics. 14 weeks ago, we saw a pretty seismic change in the United Kingdom with the election of a Labour government. We've been in office for 14 weeks after 14 years of Conservative government. And as we've heard from the other panellists, we're in a world where there is a premium on the effectiveness of your government. And truthfully, with the decisions that were taken in relation to Brexit, the referendum that we had on whether Scotland should secede from the United Kingdom, the central question of British politics in the last decade moved away from economics and became culture and belonging. Are we Scottish or are we British? Are we British or are we also European? So I welcome the fact that in the UK, partly under the weight of the cost of living challenges, the inflation challenges we've heard about, economics has made a comeback. So what we've seen in the last 14 weeks is a Labour government with a significant working majority. That matters because arguably we are now the most politically stable of any G7 economy. And while political stability does not guarantee economic stability, it certainly helps. And we've experienced a high level of volatility in the UK in recent years. So the first thing I would say is, ahead of Rachel's budget tomorrow, Britain is back and we're open for business. What is our thinking as to how to stimulate that growth? Firstly, we need to repair a fiscally impaired balance sheet for the United Kingdom. So there will be steps that we will take in the budget tomorrow to give fiscal stability and more broadly financial stability to the United Kingdom. Our mantra, if you like, is stability, investment and reform. So as well as the moves that will be taken on fiscal policy yesterday, we had our own International Investment Summit in the UK just a couple of weeks ago, securing more than £60 billion worth of new investments. And at the same time, we've got an ambitious agenda, as we'll talk about on this panel, in relation to the use of digitization and AI in our public services. So stability, investment and reform is the mantra. We've got an active industrial policy, an active trade policy, and in that sense, we're broadly confident that the judgment we heard from the IMF and the World Bank at the spring meetings will be vindicated by a strong pro-growth agenda tomorrow.
And you genuinely believe that you can avoid the risk of we're talking about migration, I'm talking about people leaving the UK at this point. I mean, there's been a real reputational damage done to the United Kingdom, and even cabinet ministers from this current Labour government are saying, and Wes Streeting said, we're stuck in the slow lane as far as growth is concerned. So you know, that must worry you, and there must be a perceptual risk. You know,
So I first served in the cabinet of Tony Blair, and when he was asked what his priorities were, he said, education, education, education. I can assure this audience that our priorities for the UK economy, growth, growth, growth. We have a government-wide commitment to driving forward and raising the trend rate of growth of the UK economy. And critically, if you look at where the UK has been in recent years, we simply have not invested sufficiently in our capital stock. And we cannot do that by public investment alone. We need also the capital markets to see the UK as a stable, attractive location for inward investment. And that's why we're at events like this today.
And we are going to get onto sort of AI, advanced technology and innovation, the opportunities that those provide, the concerns that people have and how policy might help skew, you know, us down an optimistic future for technology momentarily. Minister Şimşek, let me just come to you, because you were appointed finance minister last year to invoke an economic turnaround, which has meant reversing a policy experiment promoted by your president, which who is a self-declared enemy of interest rates. Now, 2 years on, we've seen the impact of higher interest rates on inflation around the world. Rates in your country have been hiked from 8.5% to 50%, bringing inflation down from 75% to 52% in August. There's a whole load of numbers in there. My point is, that is progress, but against the kind of run of what is happening around the world, there is still an awful lot of work to do. And Turkey's cost of living crisis is, of course, well documented. How challenging is it going to be to keep inflation down whilst balancing economic growth? And what are your sort of key priorities?
Well, thank you. The worst is behind us. Inflation is falling. I think it will continue to fall because monetary policy is tight. Fiscal policy will tighten further. Incomes policy is going to be more supportive. We've already addressed external vulnerabilities. Current account deficit has been on the mend. The deficit is down to 1/6 of what it was a year and a half ago. And reserves are up by over $100 billion US. So I think now it's time to make these gains durable. And that requires structural change. Clearly includes green transition, digital transformation. We have a very broad reform agenda, and we're beginning to deliver on that. So while last few years have been complicated, challenging.
That's an understatement.
But I think if you look at the journey so far, the program is on track. It is delivering. This is a sizable economy. Referring to raise criteria, one advantage we have is that debt to GDP ratio is only 26% in Turkey. So we have a very low debt to GDP ratio. Working age population growth is still there. We don't really have growth problems. So temporarily, we may have to go on a short-term diet. But if you look at the last 100 years, growth has been close to 5%. Last 20 plus years, close to 5.5%, 6%. So we don't have a growth issue. It's just a matter of addressing some of the structural, impediments, such as attaining price stability, which is now our top policy priority.
A lot of talk about the shifting landscape, a lot of talk about why we should be concerned. There should be a healthy dose of concern as policy is organized. But let's ensure that we inject a real note of optimism in this conversation. Artificial intelligence and advanced technologies are being hailed as the next industrial revolution. They are here, we are seeing it, we are living it. We are all, to a certain extent, I think at the beginning of our AI journey, many of us, I'm sure there are some people in the room here who are complete experts, and I've met a number of people who are doing extraordinary things with AI and advanced technologies, but many of us are at the beginning of our journey. And many of us have concerns about what policy frameworks will look like, what regulatory frameworks will look like in order to ensure that we use this transformative tech for good and for progress. Minister, where do you start? With regards policy, and let's keep this, because I've been told this is the board of policymakers. Let's be very, very focused here. I talked about the opportunity that you have here and countries around this region have for agility in policy making. AI and advanced tech necessitates new policy frameworks, new regulatory frameworks, new guardrails, new safety environments for us. What are you doing to ensure that the investment here in this advanced technology is going to work for all of us, for the good of society, but also for progress?
Well, there are two sides to the issue. One is enabling the uptake, the use, the demand of AI, and some of it, there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns, as you alluded to. So I think we're all in a discovery mode. But what we're doing in Saudi Arabia is having balanced framework on data privacy, data sovereignty and data security, but shifting more towards enablement of the applications of AI. And you see it today in healthcare. We have the world's largest virtual health care facility. Saha is our virtual hospital. They just won the Guinness Book of Records, and the Kingdom is integrating our virtual digital health facility with a global network that we want to also extend it to people who cannot reach a healthcare facility. But that is going to, think diagnostics, think translation, getting patients who don't speak the same language using AI algorithms that will give them think of emergency cases when people still don't have an ambulance. So all of that is going to be enabled, and Saudi Arabia is leaning forward on more risky, if you want to call it. The same thing with drug discovery and some of the great things. And conservatively in the Middle East, and I think it's too conservative, PwC estimated that the market will quickly, incrementally in digital, will grow up by $26 billion on the demand. So there is a huge demand here. But I think what I want to focus on and what will be announced throughout this conference this week is Saudi Arabia is going to be the disruptor. It's going to be, you know, the maker of a different ecosystem for actually incubating AI algorithms, the LLMs, in data centers that will have everything they need. Energy, I think, has been mentioned all day about the critical factor. The kingdom's cost of energy has been, you know, it's World Bank publication that says 50% lower than our peers in the G20. We're about less than 20% of that of Europe. We're significantly more than the US, definitely in the Far East. Land is abundant and is prioritized to be allocated. Construction cost is competitive. So and capital is being allocated with a priority by the PIF and other private sector companies that are building AI data centers as we speak, together with international investors that come to our ministry and they get their license and permit and create their joint ventures or do it on their own, 100% foreign-owned data centers within days and weeks. We don't need years to do this. So speed and agility, as you mentioned, throughout the investment ecosystem is critical in today's world, and it is being deployed at AI.
And there's a real competitive edge here. I mean, there's no doubt about that when it comes to that speed and agility within the sort of, you know, policy spectrum. Matt, I'm going to keep it as tight as possible because we've got about 4 minutes left. You gave me the sense that you think AI and new technologies are exacerbating already existing digital divides between the North and global South. Just a 60-second soundbite, if you will. How do you think that can change?
What is happening in Turkey, what is happening in Saudi Arabia is part of the solution. Because the risk that you have today is to have algorithms which are trained and developed and have a concentration on the foundational models. And that will be very dangerous because you will create herding in the financial market, in other sectors. The fact that right now we have diversity in the source of producing foundation models in AI will be extremely important. And I really commend what Saudi Arabia and Turkey and other countries are doing. Secondly, source of data. Today, a lot of the AI models are run by synthetic data. It means they are not real data. So more we expand the data centers in part of the world where you have a fast-growing population, so more you will be able to use real data to be able to run the model and train the model. That will be giving us more accurate solution. The third element for me, which is also important, we didn't talk about it, is genomics. In the health solutions today, most of the genetic pool used for medicine precision solutions are coming from Caucasian groups. And to diversifying today the source of genomics, we change radically the solutions that are provided in solutions. So I think I see opportunities, but I think that opportunities and risk, but these risks are being addressed if we bring more of the emerging countries in that space.
Douglas Alexander, AI, how do you ensure that the rewards outweigh the risks?
So countries and companies need not misread the environment, otherwise they fail. So first of all, how big is this? AI in 2024 is like the internet in 1999. It is about to change absolutely everything. It was a fellow Scotsman, James Watt, who invented the steam engine. Reid Hoffman calls AI the steam engine of the mind. So it's got a huge role to play in raising productivity and thereby raising growth in OECD and other markets. But it's an unusual public policy challenge Normally, politicians know where they want to go, but are unsure how to build consent to get there. My sense is global policymakers genuinely want to get this right, but aren't entirely sure it's the regulatory destination. So in the UK, we hosted the Bletchley Park Conference, the first global summit on AI. We've got a huge responsibility to build on that work. We've had about $22 billion worth of investment in AI over the last 10 years in the UK. So we're going to have a big focus not just on the regulatory piece, but also the adaptation and enablement piece. And we're very confident that AI is going to be the next big story in terms of productivity.
Ray.
AI?
Technology.
For
based.
the last, I don't know, 30 years, I've been systemizing the decision-making, computer decision-making. I've been using AI. I think that this is the greatest revolution because it applies to all thought. So it's better than the Industrial Revolution, steam engines, and all of those things. This is going to be revolutionary, but I think that it will have to work in not just the it has to work in the areas that you're operating in, the applications, the verticals. And I think that that's where the value is, the usage of it. And I think that AI is not yet, for most people, a good decision maker. And it should be a good decision maker. That when you embed your criteria and then you use it as a partner, a thought partner, so that you can make decisions in that way, it's going to be fantastic, but it's fantastic anyway. So everybody must be using it and learning from each other to make it practical.
Digital assistant rather than the master, though, I would hope.
Partner.
Yeah.
A partner.
Yeah, a partner, a digital partner. Thank you. I'm going to leave you with the last word, sir, if I can. We've covered the cause for caution. We have certainly covered the opportunities, a sense of optimism. And when you live in this region, as I do and have done for more than a decade, there is a real benefit to an optimistic outlook, optimistic decisions being made that help us all ride the crest of a sort of future-facing outlook. I want you just to use the final 30 seconds to deliver your vision for Saudi Arabia in an optimistic, through an optimistic lens.
Well, let me just make sure it's clear. Optimism doesn't mean complacency about risk management. And the kingdom has everything you can imagine in terms of managing all kinds of risk, security risk, cybersecurity risk, and what have you, and economic risk, including fiscal and monetary, which is displayed in our policy known to all, which has allowed us to navigate through all of the shocks and headwinds we have faced. But I would just like to say that the kingdom ticks all of the boxes that many of my colleagues have talked about: political stability, economic stability, fiscal stability, monetary stability, a young population, a country that is open. About a third of our population are international residents that call Saudi Arabia home, and they're powering economy. So we don't have an immigration phobia or problem, and the kingdom is the melting pot. Our investors, as I mentioned, have voted with their feet and with their money, and they're pouring in. I want to end by saying investors are not only coming to Saudi Arabia for our sizable, growing, vibrant market. They're coming to Saudi Arabia to address the world and certainly the broader region, and we have initiated a program called the Regional Headquarter Program. Our target was 500 regional headquarters by 2030. I'm glad to announce for the first time that we've reached 540 by this morning. Some of them are the major multinational companies that are with us today, and they will be individually announcing their RHQ. This is an opportunity for companies to come and partner with us, address the challenges that are real, that we want to address, but also turn many of them into opportunities. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure being the secretary of this board, your board of policymakers, ladies and gentlemen.